The marble mind, how Athena outscheduled the gods. Born from a headache, Athena's unusual origins and the bureaucracy of Olympus. You're about to hear the story of a goddess not known for wild parties or chaotic wars, but for paperwork precision, urban planning, and strategic wisdom. This is the story of Athena, not the flashy goddess of drama, but the one who organized Athens' defenses, color-coded her temple scrolls, and quietly kept Olympus from falling apart under the weight of its own inefficiency. Let's begin, not at the height of her powers, but with one of the strangest births in mythological history, one that feels more like a bureaucratic incident than a miracle. The headache that launched a goddess. Zeus, king of the gods, had a problem. It wasn't another rebellion or a Trojan War. No, this was internal. Literally, he had a splitting headache. Not the kind that comes from divine wine or Hera's constant disapproval, but the kind that pulsed with such intensity that it could only be mythological in nature. This headache was Athena. The story goes that Zeus, fearing a prophecy that his child by the Titaness Métis would surpass him, swallowed Métis whole. Not unusual behavior for Zeus, who solved most of his issues by absorbing them or flinging them into Tartarus. But Métis was no ordinary consort. She was the embodiment of deep thought and wise counsel. Pregnant with Athena and now inside Zeus, she did what she knew best, continued to advise him from within. One day, unable to bear the pain, Zeus called upon Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith. The solution? Open head surgery, without anesthesia. Hephaestus cracked Zeus's skull with an axe, and from the wound leapt Athena, fully grown, clad in armor, and already suspiciously organized. The other gods stared. A newborn goddess with a spear in one hand and a law code in the other was not a typical Tuesday in Olympus. Athena didn't cry. She filed a status report. This moment was not just a bizarre myth, but the first sign that Athena wasn't going to be like the others. She had emerged not from chaos, like most Olympians, but from thought, strategy, and perhaps even bureaucracy. She didn't represent war itself. That was Ares's gig. Athena was about strategy, planning, and rational conflict resolution. Her first steps set the tone for a life that would involve civic reforms, temple layouts, and battle tactics more than divine affairs or love stories. Olympus, the office of eternal immortals. To truly appreciate Athena, you need to understand the environment she worked in. Olympus might sound glamorous, but in day-to-day operations, it was more like an overstretched government department. You had gods with unclear job roles, overlaps in portfolio. How many sun gods do you really need? And constant interpersonal conflict. Poseidon wanted dominion over cities, but rarely showed up on time. Dionysus threw festivals without permits. Apollo scheduled prophecies at odd hours. And Ares? He mostly just fought with himself. Into this chaos stepped Athena. Her first contributions weren't showy. Instead of throwing thunderbolts or turning people into trees, she proposed zoning laws. She invented the bridle so horses could be controlled, useful in war, but also in agriculture. She taught weaving, not just as art, but as labor organization. She suggested the olive tree as a gift to mortals, not just because it was useful, but because it could form the foundation of sustainable trade. Athena thought long-term. While her fellow gods were chasing nymphs or plotting vengeance, Athena was creating filing systems. She categorized monsters. She advised heroes with SWOT analysis. She even organized her own temple construction with an eye for both defensive positioning and sunlight optimization. Athens, the city that voted for a goddess. Athena's greatest PR campaign came when she competed with Poseidon for patronage over a small rocky region known then simply as Cecropia. Poseidon, predictable and showy, struck the ground with his trident and offered a saltwater spring or, in some versions, a warhorse. Athena, ever practical, planted an olive tree. It was an underwhelming sight at first, short, gnarled, and dusty. But the people of the city saw potential: food, oil, wood, and shade. It was a complete supply chain in one crop. The citizens voted for Athena, which was itself a reflection of her influence. While most gods demanded obedience, she encouraged civic participation. Even the vote may have been symbolic, but the message was clear. Athena stood for strategy, not spectacle. Thus the city became Athens, a place where her ideals, rational governance, military readiness, and civic responsibility would root themselves deeply. It's no surprise that Athens would go on to invent democracy, build the Parthenon, and drive Socratic thinking. Athena didn't just win the city, she built its identity. The virgin goddess in a world of entanglements. Unlike many of her counterparts, Athena remained famously chaste, not because she was indifferent to beauty or pleasure. She loved art and philosophy, but because she simply didn't have time for the mess. While gods were busy creating mythological family trees with more twists than a Greek tragedy, Athena stayed focused. Her temples were places of learning, not longing. Mortals admired her for this. Soldiers prayed to her before battle, but so did artisans and teachers. She belonged to no one group. She wasn't a goddess of the elite nor of the wild. She was for those who prepared, studied, and thought 3 steps ahead. But even Athena's rational mind had limits. She could be severe, even ruthless. When Arachne challenged her in weaving, Athena didn't just beat her, she turned her into a spider. It was a moment of pettiness from an otherwise structured being. Maybe even overachievers have bad days. The quiet power of systems. Athena's real legacy lies in systems. She believed in rules, not as constraints, but as frameworks for excellence. She introduced trial by jury. She inspired the creation of naval codes. She even advised heroes like Odysseus, not with brute strength, but with cleverness. She didn't give him a sword, she gave him ideas. In many ways, Athena was the ancient world's first project manager. She didn't just lead, she coordinated. While others chased fame or revenge, she created the infrastructure that made civilization possible. But you have to wonder, did this efficiency come at a cost? Did Athena's devotion to order blind her to the chaos that makes life, well, livable? And what happened when even Athena's wisdom was not enough to stop the tides of change? The strategy behind the spear, how Athena built civilization one policy at a time. You already know how Athena arrived. Fully armored, leaping from the head of Zeus, the product not of lust or vengeance, but of thought and planning. She did not scream nor wail, nor raise Olympus with a dramatic tantrum. She simply assessed, calculated, scheduled, and then she set to work. But what did it actually mean for a goddess to build civilization? What did her plans look like in the daily grind of ancient human life? As you'll see, her influence was not in epic battles or divine lightning bolts, but in thread counts, jury selections, and grain quotas. Weaving, not just an art, but economic policy. Let's start with something seemingly ordinary, weaving. In the myths, Athena teaches mortals how to weave. You might imagine this as a quaint scene, looms, gentle songs, cloth fluttering in a Mediterranean breeze. But the significance is deeper and more quietly transformative. Before industrial looms and mechanized labor, weaving was the heartbeat of a household economy. In ancient Greece, textiles weren't merely clothing. They were currency, dowry, status, and trade. Spun wool measured a household's wealth more reliably than silver did. Teaching weaving was like teaching finance, engineering, and logistics rolled into one. Athena didn't just teach technique, she taught discipline. How to spin flax to minimize waste. How to dye consistently with local plants. How to calculate thread density for tunics versus rugs. Her patterns, preserved through generations, often mirrored mathematical symmetry, evidence of her preference for order. Even the myth of Arachne, the gifted mortal who challenged Athena to a weaving contest, was not about petty rivalry, as it's often retold. It was about quality control, intellectual property, and perhaps even plagiarism. Arachne's tapestry was undeniably perfect, but it mocked the gods, ridiculed Olympus's scandals, and ignored sacred form. Athena, enraged not by competition but by the breach of decorum, struck the loom, shredded the threads, and turned Arachne into a spider. A harsh sentence, yes, but from Athena's view, a lesson in respectful innovation. Arachne spun forever, alone, outside society. An artisan without an audience. A cautionary tale not of talent, but of unchecked pride in a structured world. Civic justice and the birth of the jury system. Athena was one of the first deities to codify justice not as divine punishment, but as communal participation. The myth of Orestes is often cited. Orestes, having murdered his mother Clytemnestra to avenge his father Agamemnon, is tormented by the Furies, ancient deities of vengeance who cared little for context. In earlier ages, this would have ended one way, eternal torment. But Athena intervenes, not by divine decree, but by summoning a jury of Athenians to hear the case. It was the first trial by jury in mythic memory. A tie vote. Athena, as presiding judge, breaks the tie, favoring mercy. She doesn't override the court. She participates in it. The lesson here wasn't subtle. Justice belonged to the people, not just to gods or kings. In her vision of civilization, even murder could be debated, weighed, and judged by mortals. This shift from vengeance to verdicts laid the groundwork for democratic processes. The court of the Areopagus in Athens was said to trace its origin to this very myth. It would go on to hear cases, pass laws, and serve as one of the oldest continuous courts in recorded history. Athena was not there in divine splendor. She was there in every judge's careful pause, every citizen's vote, every parchment sealed in wax. Not shouting decrees, but whispering through policy. The olive tree, an agricultural empire in a seed. The olive tree may not inspire excitement today. It is a staple of Mediterranean life, common and mild. But in ancient times, it was revolutionary. When Athena planted the first olive tree on the Acropolis during her contest with Poseidon, the citizens of Cecropia may have seen only modest potential. But Athena knew better. The olive didn't just feed people, it built trade networks. It offered oil for cooking, lighting, healing. It's what built tools. Its leaves fed animals in lean seasons. Its roots prevented erosion on rocky hills. Athena's choice was not aesthetic, it was systemic. A complete resource solution. Low water usage, high longevity, multi-purpose yield. In a region plagued by thin soils and summer droughts, the olive tree became a symbol of sustainable planning. And over time, this one tree multiplied. Olive groves were carefully mapped, their yields recorded in temple archives. Farmers learned pruning schedules, crop rotations, and pest control, not as divine revelation, but as civic responsibility. Even the olive press, an innovation of Hellenic villages, was a product of Athena's mindset. How to extract the most from the least, how to refine nature without abusing it. One tree, one crop, a blueprint for an economy. Athena and the soft side of warfare. While Ares bellowed on battlefields, Reveling in gore and brute force, Athena preferred the chessboard. She advised heroes like Perseus and Odysseus not with strength, but with strategy. Perseus, tasked with beheading Medusa, would have failed in a direct assault. Instead, Athena gave him a polished shield to see Medusa's reflection without turning to stone. It wasn't a weapon, it was a tactic. Odysseus, too, became a vessel of her intellect. The Trojan horse, arguably the most famous ruse in Western lore, was attributed to her inspiration. 10 years of war ended not with conquest, but with concealment, deception, and timing. In all these stories, Athena's presence is quiet but defining, not in the thick of battle, but in the planning rooms, not in the sword swing, but in the angle of the ambush. This was her view of war, a necessary evil, best handled with efficiency and minimal bloodshed. If violence must occur, let it be swift, strategic, and final, a far cry from the endless duels of other gods. Athena's warriors were not berserkers, they were generals, engineers, tacticians, and those who truly embodied her values, like the disciplined hoplites of Athens, learned to fight as a unit, not as glory-seeking individuals. You could say she built not just cities, but the very notion of statehood defense. Knowledge as infrastructure. Athena's temples were not just houses of worship. They were centers of learning. Inscriptions detail scrolls kept in stone boxes. Students taught mathematics in colonnades. Travelers recorded regional dialects within temple walls, creating the first linguistic surveys of the Greek world. One curious example comes from the Acropolis, where temple assistants maintained ledgers of donated armor, not as trophies, but as logistical records. Who gave what? From where? For which campaign? These records eventually informed defense strategies, troop logistics, and taxation estimates. Quietly, boringly, Athena's influence became embedded in data. If Hermes was the messenger, Athena was the archivist. Her worship was less about incense and sacrifice, and more about civic participation. Showing up to court, tending groves, reading decrees, learning to navigate the agora. These were acts of devotion. She made piety practical, but even a goddess so efficient must encounter resistance. And as Athens grew under her banner, cracks began to show. Expansion bred arrogance. Democracy wobbled. And Sparta, Athena's philosophical opposite, rose in stark contrast. Could Athena's blueprint for civilization survive the turmoil ahead? And was wisdom alone enough to guard a city from itself? Legacy in marble. How Athena's quiet blueprint survived the fall of the gods. You've followed Athena from the moment she emerged, fully formed and armored, from the skull of Zeus. You've seen how she wove her influence into the very texture of Greek civilization, through household industry, civic law, agricultural policy, and strategic warfare. But what became of all that careful design? Did her quiet legacy persist through the rise and fall of city-states, through empires and invasions, or did it fade into marble ruins and half-remembered rituals? To answer that, we now look beyond myth. We turn to the archaeological dust, the municipal records scratched into stone, and the daily routines of people who never met a god, yet lived by her silent logic. The Parthenon, a temple of ratios, not just worship. High on the Acropolis of Athens stands what might appear to be just another ruined temple, albeit an elegant one. The Parthenon. You've likely seen its image countless times. Rows of Doric columns, white against blue sky, often filtered in tourist photos. But the Parthenon wasn't just a shrine. It was a physical embodiment of Athena's ideals: precision, restraint, symmetry, and purpose. Constructed between 447 and 432 BCE, during the height of Athenian power, the Parthenon was designed not for frenzied worship or spectacle, but as a storehouse of civic identity. Built by architects Ectinos and Callicrates under the supervision of the sculptor Phidias, it was calibrated down to the millimeter. The curvature of its base, imperceptible to the eye, prevented optical illusion sagging. Columns leaned slightly inward. Every angle was adjusted to create the illusion of perfect straightness. This wasn't just architectural flourish. It was an act of order. The structure whispered of balance in a world increasingly chaotic. Inside, it stored not only sacred artifacts, but also public records, war spoils, and gold reserves. In times of emergency, it functioned as a treasury. In other words, it was a filing cabinet in stone. Athena didn't need a statue to enforce her presence, though one stood there, massive and gold-leafed. Her real presence was in the measurements, the clean geometry, the duality of form and function. You didn't just look at the Parthenon. You operated within its framework, sometimes without realizing it. The quiet power of clerks and record-keepers. While other gods inspired rituals and festivals, Athena lingered in bureaucracy. One of her most mundane legacies, though also one of the most important, was the standardization of civic administration. Athens, under her philosophical and mythical patronage, developed a unique system of rotating citizen officials. Known as archons, these roles were not filled by the wealthy elite alone, but through lottery from among eligible male citizens. It was a system as tedious as it was democratic. Every year, hundreds of citizens served as magistrates, jurors, and council members. Their proceedings were documented, sometimes on large stone slabs displayed in the agora. Others were filed within the matroon, the old records office. Many of these inscriptions still survive, dry records of tax policies, trade routes, building contracts, and temple maintenance schedules. It is through these that we glimpse Athena's influence most directly. One particularly unexciting, but revealing, inscription from the 5th century BC. It details the cost of roof tiles for a public building. Another outlines regulations for selling fish in the market. Neither inspires epic poetry, but both show a city striving for accountability, structure, and civic clarity. Athena lived in these lists. She wasn't a goddess who demanded blood sacrifice. She demanded paperwork, the echo of Athena in Rome and beyond. As Athens declined and Rome rose, the gods of Olympus shifted in popularity. The Romans, never shy about borrowing deities, took Athena and renamed her Minerva. But they kept her essence: intellect, war strategy, crafts, and civic law. In Rome, Minerva was one of the Capitoline triad, alongside Jupiter and Juno. Her temple sat on the Aventine Hill, not far from the guild halls where artisans and scribes worked. She was honored in festivals not with orgies or bloodletting, but with recitations and craft displays. Even as the empire expanded, her name remained associated with libraries, planning councils, and military strategy. Her owl, a symbol of patient wisdom, appeared in coins, crests, and scrollwork margins. Centuries later, during the Enlightenment, scholars like Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes referenced Minerva as the symbol of reason. Even modern academic institutions have kept her alive, her image used by universities, law schools, and even national symbols. She became less a deity and more a concept, one etched into systems, not statues. She survived, quietly, in curricula and codes. Athena's fade into the background. No deity remains in power forever. The temples eventually fell. Statues crumbled. Christianity replaced the old myths with new stories, new saints, and new moral structures. Athena, like so many others, was pushed aside, but her spirit lingered, often where least expected. In a town clerk balancing civic ledgers. In an engineer designing aqueducts with calculated precision. In a judge weighing mercy against justice. In the tedious processes that make civilization function, not with glory, but with stability. Athena was never loud. Her victories were never in shouting matches. Her miracles came through systems, logic, and structure. She built not monuments, but mindsets. And perhaps that is why she endured, not as a goddess, but as a ghost in the machine of civilization. So the question remains, if Athena still lives in our laws, our schedules, our classrooms, and our habits, do we still believe in her, even without temples? Or are we just following her calendar, unaware she wrote it in the first place?